So welcome everybody to this latest video on 162 Maths, and in this video we'll be going over GCSE Maths Higher revision topic tests on quadratic graphs. Now before we get started working through these questions, a reminder that a copy of the questions is available to download by clicking on the link in the description, and I strongly recommend having a go at these questions so you can see what you can and can't do before continuing watching this video as we go through the answers. Also be sure to check out the 162 Maths contents page for easy access on video lessons covering all the topics, not only in Key Stage 3 but also GCSE A-level content, along with all of the revision resources such as topic tests and exam paper walkthroughs. So let's get started on question 1. So question 1 says here is a graph of y equals x squared plus 2x minus 1 for the values of x from minus 3 to 2. And what that means is that they've given us the graph between x equals minus 3 and 2. So from this, what the question is asking us to do is to find the y-intercept, find the turning point, find the negative root, and find the positive root. Well, the y-intercept is where the curve crosses the y-axis, which is at this point here, and the coordinate of that is 0, minus 1. Then for the turning point, which is at this point here, that has got a coordinate of minus 2, no it isn't, it's minus 1 and minus 2. And then the question then asks for the negative root. Well, the negative root is where the curve crosses the x-axis, so that's going to be at that point there. And then what I then need to do is just give the coordinate for that. So I'm going to say that's roughly around about minus 2.4 and 0. And the positive root, which is this value here, which I'm going to say is positive 0.4 and 0. Then moving on to question 2, it says complete the table of values for y equals x squared plus 3x minus 1. Now for this, what you need to do, now depending on whether this is a calculated paper or a non-calculated paper, what you need to do is basically swap the number as x in the table with with x, which is what I've highlighted here. So to work out this number here, I'm going to type in minus 2 squared plus 3 lots of minus 2 minus 1. Now if this was non-calculator, you would actually work that out. So minus 2 squared is 4. 3 times negative 2 is minus 6, minus 1, and that gives me an answer of negative 3. Then substituting 0, well that's going to be the y-intercept. So if you then substitute 0, or x equals 0, we're going to end up with 0 squared plus 3 lots of 0 minus 1, which is just negative 1. And then finally for this one we just substitute x equals 1, so that's 1 squared plus 3 lots of 1 minus 1, which gives me an answer of positive 3. Now what you should find when you're doing quadratic curves is that you should find a repeated pattern of the y ordinates, and as you can see it repeats at this particular point here. Now the next thing for us to do is then correctly plot these points. So what we need to do is plot these points. So at minus 4, 3, so that's going to be at that point there. Minus 3, negative 1, which is here. 2, negative 3, so I'll just move this down a smidge. Then I get minus 2, minus 3 is here. Then at negative 1, it's at minus 3 as well, so it's there. Then at, let's just see so we can see the actual numbers. And at 0, it's a negative 1. At 1, it's 3. And at 2, it's 9. So it's going to be over here. Then all that's left for me to then do is carefully join these points up with a smooth curve. Now, just a word of warning, this is going to be extremely difficult doing it on the computer, but you should have a nice smooth parabola shape that goes through this. Now, what you should find is, it should be a nice smooth curve or something that represents a U. As long as you get something that looks like that, then that should be fine. The next question then asks us to, using the graph, to estimate the value of y when x equals minus a half. Now minus a half is at this point here. So what the question's asking me to do is to find what that number there is going to be. Now looking at this, I'm actually going to do the curve again because it looks awfully wrong. So now in terms of this, what you should find is looking like this and like so. That's a little bit better. Now yours will hopefully be a lot more accurate, but hopefully you get the gist. So the question asking what's the value of x, and we're looking for this number here. Now on the mark scheme it says any acceptable answer between negative 2.2 and minus 2.3. So if as long as your answer is between those numbers, then that is absolutely fine. It then says use your graph to estimate the solutions of x squared plus 3x minus 1 equals 0. Well, this is the roots. So it's basically where the curve crosses the x-axis, and it crosses the x-axis at this point here and at this point here. Now where possible acceptable answers are going to be for the first one, well the positive one, it's going to be any answer between 0.3 to 0.6, or, and it's important that you write or, the negative value is going to be any number between minus 3.5 to negative 3.1. So as long as your answer is within that frame, then that is absolutely fine for that one. Moving on to question 3, it says the equation of x squared plus 2x minus 8 equals 0 can be written as x plus 1 squared minus 9 equals 0. Below is a sketch of x squared plus 2x minus 8, and the question is asking us to work out the coordinates of A, B, C and D. Well, looking at this, A and D are the roots, or the solutions as you may want to call it, as it's a quadratic. B is the minimum point, and the reason why it's a minimum point is because it's a positive parabola, and C is the y-intercept. Now whenever you see the word or trying to find the y-intercept, that's basically where x equals 0, so that's what you want to substitute in. And for the roots and solutions, what you want to do is solve the quadratic. Now the fact that they've given it in two particular ways, or they're giving it as in completing the square format, should make one of those a little bit easier for us to work with. So looking at this particular question, A and D are the two solutions. So looking at the original equation, which if I write down again, so the original was y equals x squared plus 2x minus 8. So I want to solve x squared plus 2x minus 8. This does factorize, in which we get our numbers of 4 and 2. I don't know why I've written 6 there. So we've got 4 and 2. As the 2x is positive, that's going to mean that our biggest number is going to be positive, and as it's a negative, it means that we've got difference in signs of the two brackets. So solving this, we get x equals negative 4 or positive 2, which kind of resembles where A and B are. So the coordinates for A, which is our negative root, is going to be minus 4, 0, and the D is the positive root, and that's going to have a coordinate of 2, 0. Next is then finding out what the minimum point is. Well, they gave us the equation in the format of completing the square. So it's x plus 1 squared minus 9 equals 0. Well, the minimum point is when minus a b of x plus a squared plus b. Now the x ordinate is always the value of x that makes the bracket equal to 0. So looking at this, the value of x that makes that bracket equal to 0 is going to be negative 1. And the y ordinate is always this. So y ordinate of the minimum point. So B is going to be at -1, -9. Then following with C, C is the y-intercept when x equals 0. So if I pick any of the two equations, so whether I'm using this or I'm using this, well, let's just take this one here because we've got more space. So I'm going to have 0 squared plus 2 lots of 0 minus 8, which gives me an answer of -8. So that means that C is going to have a coordinate of -8 now. 0 minus 8, and there we go for that one. Moving on to question 4a, it's asking us to expand and simplify this bracket. So again, multiplying x by x gives us x squared, x plus times 2 is plus 2x, minus 5x minus 10, and then we just need to simplify the coefficients of x, so we've got x squared minus 3x minus 10. Now for B, it then says write down the coordinate of the y-intercept of this. Well, that's just going to be when x equals 0. So when x equals 0, we end up with 0 minus 5, 0 plus 2, which gives me minus 5 times positive 2, which equals 10. So that's going to have a y-ordinate of 0 minus 10. Then for question 5, it's asking us to factorise x squared plus 5x minus 14. So again, just factorising the quadratic. And this does factorise that it tells us to, in which my two numbers are going to be 7 and 2, and it's going to be plus 7 minus 2. Or you can factorise it using completing the square, which is entirely up to you. Personally, I wouldn't, but again, technically that would be allowed because you have factorised it. In which you would end up with x plus 5 over 2 squared minus 14 minus 25 over 4. And that's going to give me, and again just working it over the side here, x plus 5 over 2 squared minus, and that's going to be 56 over 4 minus 25 over 4, which gives me x plus 5 over 2 squared minus 81 over 4, in which you could write this answer, or you can write that answer. Then I'm going to go for that one there, as it's one that's the most easiest. Then for 5b, it then says write down the coordinates of the roots of this. So we just need to solve this. So if we factorize this, which we did in part A, we end up with this equals 0. So x is going to equal minus 7 or positive 2. So the two coordinates are going to be minus 7, 0 and 2, 0. Then working with question 6, it says write the equation of x squared plus 5x minus 6 in the form of completing the square. So this is completing the square. So for this, it's going to be x plus 3 squared minus 5 minus 3 squared. That's x plus 3 squared minus 5 minus 9, which gives me x plus 3 squared minus 14. And there we go. And equals 0 we need to write. Then moving on to question 8b, it says sketch the graph. Well, the fact that we know that the y-intercept, whenever you're sketching, there's a couple of things you need to mention. So you kind of need to show where it crosses the x-axis, and you also need to know where the y-intercept is. Now, for this, what we need to do, as it's worth 3 marks, so the x-intercept is by solving x squared plus 6x minus 5 equals 0. Now, because we've already got it in completing the square form, we've got x plus 3 squared minus 14 equals 0. So solving this for x, we end up with x plus 3 squared equals 14. Then x plus 3 equals the square root of 14 plus minus. So x equals negative 3 plus minus root 14. So my two y-intercepts are going to be, if I just draw my parabola, and that's going to be, let's just move this down a little bit. There we go. And so my two y ordinates are this, so x equals -3 minus 14, or -3 plus this. Now this is going to give me a negative answer, this is going to give me a positive answer. Now the reason why I know that root 14 is going to be positive is, -3 plus root 14 is going to be positive, is because root 14 has got to be bigger than 3, because 3 squared is 9 and square root of 9 is 14, square root of 9 is 3. So root 14 must be a number that's bigger than 3, so therefore we'll end up with a positive answer. Now that's the y ordinates. The y-intercept is when x equals 0. So making x equals 0, I end up with 0 squared plus 6 lots of 0 minus 5, which equals -5. So what I end up with, and then using computing the square, which I've already done in part A, in which I ended up with this. So this means that I've got a minimum point at -3 minus 14. So what the graph will eventually look like is it'll look something like this, where this point here is -3 minus root 14. This point here is -3 plus root 14. This value here is -5. And this point here is -3 minus 14. And there we go. Moving on to question 7, it says the quadratic shown is asymmetrical about the line x equals -2. And the question for part A is asking, C is the reflection of A in the line of symmetry, write down the coordinates of C. Well, for this, we know that C is definitely, as it's on a straight horizontal line, as it's symmetrical, it's going to have the same y ordinate, so that means it's going to be 16. So the only thing left for me to then do is find out what the new x ordinate for C is going to be. Now in terms of this line here, which is x equals -2, that if I then, using that coordinate, which is 3, and this is -2, that means that this line here is 5 away, which means that C is going to be 5 away in that direction. So starting with -2 minus 5, that gives me an answer of -7. So the x ordinate of C is going to be -7, giving us a coordinate of -7, 16. Then moving on to question 7b, it says the point D has an x ordinate of 1, work out the missing y ordinate. Well, going back to the original line, which was well, actually we don't know what that is, so first of all we need to find out what the coordinate is. So the equation of the curve, well, as it's got a minimum point of -2, 9, that means that A is going to be +2 and B is going to be -9 in x plus A squared plus B. So the equation of the curve is y equals x plus 2 squared minus 9. So substituting 1, x equals 1, into this, we end up with 3 squared minus 9, which gives us an answer of 0. So the y ordinate is going to be 0. And then moving on to our last question, it says the quadratic graph shown is symmetrical about the line x equals 1. D is a reflection of the line A. Write down the coordinates of D. So again, very similar to the previous question. So my line of symmetry is x equals 1. The y ordinate for D is going to be the same. So that's 12. So D is going to have a y ordinate of 12. So then working out the difference between, and this is going to be 1, of 1 and 5. So that's 4. So then I then need to count from 1 take away 4. So 1 take away 4 is -3. So that means that D is going to have an ordinate of -3, 12. Then for B, it's then asking us to say that C is the point 1, 0. Work out the equation of the curve. Give your answer in the form of this. So looking at this, what we know is that the minimum point of this curve is 1 minus 4. So as min point is 1 minus 4, then using minus a, b, and x plus a squared plus b, we get x minus 1 squared minus 4. So from this then, what we can then do is then, if we use this, we can then work out what the equation of the line is going to be. So we've got y equals x minus 1 squared minus 4. Expanding this out, we get x minus 1, x minus 1. And not forgetting that minus 4, so we get y equals x squared. If I expand that out, I get minus 2x plus 1 minus 4, which gives me y equals x squared minus 2x minus 3. So my answer is y equals x squared minus 2x minus 3. And there we go.